The year is 1992. George H.W. Bush is in his fourth year in office as U.S. president. Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back is the #1 song in the world. And most importantly for our purposes, the basketball tournament at the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona is about to begin. This is the tournament of the Dream Team, the greatest basketball roster ever assembled. But that assembly was only possible because of a rule change by FIBA, the organization that governs world basketball, that would not only allow, but encourage the US to send its professional players to the Olympics. That meant that the best players in the NBA were now eligible to participate, and in 1992, that gave a distinct advantage to the Americans, because the NBA then looked very different to the one we have now. In the 91-92 season, the NBA featured 23 players born outside the US on 18 different teams. A few of those players, like Hakeem Olajuwon, Drazen Petrovic, or Dikembe Mutombo, were voted into the All-Star game or finished in the top 20 in scoring. Even 30 years ago, there was a distinct international presence in the NBA, but as soon as the Olympics began, it became pretty clear that the US was still the unquestioned leader in the sport worldwide. Fast forward to now, though, and not only is the number of international players in the league quadrupled to the point that it's less common for a team to not have an international player on it, but the last 5 league MVP awards have been given to players born outside the United States. Not only are there more of these players in the current NBA, but more and more are ending up at the top of statistical charts and in All-NBA teams every year. The fundamental makeup of the NBA has changed dramatically over the past 30 years. But how did we get from this point in 1992 to where we are now? There have been international players in the NBA going all the way back to the 1940s, but to me, the globalization of the league happened in 3 very distinct phases, the first of which really began almost a decade before those 92 Olympics. In 1984, Nigeria's Hakeem Olajuwon became the first international player chosen in the top 10 of the NBA draft. Olajuwon, however, along with fellow international #1 pick Patrick Ewing, had the benefit of getting a kind of soft launch in front of the American sports viewing public through their college careers. By the time those guys made the leap to the NBA, they were already a part of the collective conscious of the sport. Them making it was still a big deal, of course, but by the time they were drafted, the fact that they were born outside of the US was just kind of circumstantial. They'd already proven themselves in the competition that fed directly into the league. However, there was another group around this time that would not get that benefit. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, and with him came his famous endorsement of glasnost and perestroika, or openness and restructuring. The Soviet Union was about to start doing things very differently, which was surprisingly relevant to the NBA, because at the time, the Soviets had the best basketball team in the world outside of the US. Suddenly, there were opportunities for both the two countries and the players that represented them that weren't there before. In 1988, the Hawks did a 2-week-long exhibition tour of the Soviet Union alongside their national team, largely because of the relationship between Gorbachev and Hawks owner Ted Turner. More players also started to get drafted into the NBA from Soviet-controlled countries, even if, like in the case of Arvydas Sabonis, their government was less than willing to let them go play in the US. That policy did relax eventually, though, especially after the Soviet Union fell in 1991, but that doesn't mean that making the transition to the NBA was easy. In 2018, Andrew Sharp wrote an article for Sports Illustrated featuring an oral history of players who came to the NBA from overseas, in both those early years and beyond. In it, NBA executives like former Mavericks GM Donnie Nelson describe an environment of skepticism towards these international players, including some rookie hazing that stems from, quote, residual Cold War effects. Players struggled with the language barrier, weather conditions that they'd never lived in before, and physical standards that differed wildly from the leagues they were used to back home. Whether these guys succeeded or failed often depended on the environment they were drafted into. Players like Vlade Divac grew into legitimate NBA stars on teams with leaders who were willing to mentor them, but many couldn't adjust to nearly that same extent. It took an entire generation of players paving the way to have an idea of what it took to make these guys successful. Even if the talent was there, which it clearly was, catching up to the best league in the world is no easy feat, especially if you don't have a frame of reference for how to make that happen. But with the path to the league now clearly established, the next generation of international players, who grew up watching the first one, were going to have a very different experience. In March 1998, Nike held its 4th annual Hoop Summit in San Antonio, featuring some of the most talented players from around the world. Future NBA stars like Al Harrington, Quentin Richardson, and Rashard Lewis all featured for Team USA, but it was a young man from the World team, a 7-footer from Germany named Dirk Nowitzki, that stole the show. This game is where the legend of Dirk, by most accounts the greatest European player in the history of the NBA, really begins. 21 years, 12 All-NBA teams, 1 MVP, and 1 league title later, that lanky kid from Würzburg, Germany, who essentially had to sneak away from his club team to go play in that Hoop Summit game in the first place, set a new standard for what international players could do in the league. But he wouldn't be the only one. It's hard to put a distinct date on when this shift happened, but in my mind, there's a pretty clear delineation between the first generation of international players like Hakeem and Detlef Schrempf and the generation that Dirk was a part of. That second group included players like Pau Gasol and Manu Ginobili and Yao Ming, all guys who came straight from their international teams without playing in college in the US. And with them, they brought a different understanding of the game that fit right in with the league that was becoming more open and focused on stats like three-point shooting and pace. The Euro version of the game, which centered around things like spacing and collective team interactions, became incredibly important to this era of NBA basketball, and helped teams like the Spurs, Suns, and Mavericks have a ton of success playing it with their international superstars. A lot of this growth can be credited to executives like Donnie Nelson, who we mentioned a minute ago, who saw the value these guys could bring and were willing to invest time and resources into cultivating it. But with the path now established for them, and the support systems in place to help make the transition to the league smoothly, more and more international players started having more and more of an impact. Instead of being a curiosity, or even a liability depending on who you asked, international players were part of the fabric of the league now, largely because of the players that paved the way before them. They became something that teams actively coveted and sought out, spending incredibly valuable draft capital on guys from all over the world. But for all of the successes in this era, which included a run where 5 out of 6 league MVPs were born outside the US, there were also a few less successful cases, including some very high-profile ones, which freaked a whole lot of people out. Two things are pretty much always true of sports front offices. They love to copycat off each other, and they are very easily spooked. This became relevant in the early to mid-2000s because as soon as one team has a Dirk Nowitzki, everybody else is going to want one too. And why wouldn't you? By 2002, in his 4th year in the league, Dirk was averaging a double-double and making his first All-Star team, and the Mavs were in the playoffs. But some of the attempts by other teams to recreate him, including Nicholas Skidishvili and Darko Milicic, flamed out spectacularly, with a few common tropes about things like defensive capability and athleticism being used as sticks to beat them with. Teams still drafted international players really highly every now and then, but there was definitely a perception that picking these players was risky. So what happened to those guys? Was it just that they weren't good enough, or were there other factors that made them not live up to their potential? I talked about this in more depth in my video about Nikola Jokic, but there are so many things, ranging anywhere from language struggles to dietary differences to getting a visa and a place to live, that make transitioning to the NBA from another country challenging. While this era brought a ton of progress for international players in the NBA, it was also the one with the highest amount of busts, which threatened to be a big issue for players who wanted to come over in the future. The NBA and its teams had a problem. They had to find a way to make the transition to the league easier so that more of the talented players their scouts were finding could showcase that talent in the league more consistently. And through a lot of hard work, plus a pretty healthy amount of luck and circumstance, that is exactly what happened. When it comes to figuring out why there are more international players now at the elite level than ever before, you simply can't discount the role of the internet and social media. By the time Luka Doncic was about to be the 3rd overall pick in 2018, most NBA fans not only knew who he was, but had been able to watch him play pretty easily. You can find lots of highlights of him playing as a teenager for Real Madrid on this very website, including a game from 2016 against Russell Westbrook and the Thunder. People were doing in-depth analysis of Luka's game, not only in NBA video rooms, but on Twitter, where anyone could read it if they wanted to. The NBA knew Luka, and he knew them too, because in the modern era, there are so many more ways to access it worldwide than there used to be. In previous years, it took young players a couple of seasons to really get their feet under them in the league, even in the best case scenarios. But these days, players like Luka and Victor Wembanyama come out firing as soon as they get over here, largely because they've had so much more exposure to what awaits them once they are. But mere exposure is not the only thing that makes that transition easier than it used to be. Saying that would be discounting all of the truly incredible work that the NBA office has done to make sure that young players have everything they need once they get to the States, whether that's getting them hooked up with an English tutor or making sure they have a way to get to practice before they got their driver's license. Players like Victor Wembanyama may be some of the most talented people in the world, but if they're coming to the NBA from another country, they're still immigrants. Very young immigrants, in fact, who are in all likelihood going to need a lot of support to succeed in their very high-profile jobs. It's not just the players who have adapted and developed over the past 30 years, though. It's the league, too, through the work of executives like Ken Boney and Brooks Meek, as well as many of the other team executives they worked with from around the league. These people have been the ones easing the transitions of players like Nikola Jokic, so that they can focus on becoming the best basketball players in the world. It's easier to adapt to the system if the system itself improves, and that accounts for a lot of what we've seen as far as players being put in a better position to succeed. The final piece of this, in my mind, is the worldwide efforts the NBA has gone to make meaningful connections through the game around the globe. Going back to the aftermath of the Dream Team, the league has been trying to build on the global impression that team made at the '92 Olympics. That includes Basketball Without Borders, the organization that the league founded alongside FIBA in 2001 that continues to run camps in countries all over the world and has helped develop dozens of NBA players since its creation. It also includes the NBA Academy, which has locations in Australia, India, Senegal, and Mexico, and has developed NBA players like Benedict Mathurin through a system similar to what big global football clubs do with their academies. Major American leagues like MLB and the NFL love to talk about growing the game internationally, and they've been trying really hard to increase their global reach in recent years through games and even leagues in other countries. But the NBA has been on this in a meaningful way going all the way back to the early 90s, and the results speak for themselves. The last 2 rounds of MVP voting have been completely dominated by players from other countries, including a couple who participated in the NBA's outreach programs directly. Through a lot of hard work and time, the league has made itself a major presence in the international game, and by extension, made the international game a major presence in theirs. But why is that important? Going back to our original question, why are the best players in the NBA right now coming from outside the United States? The first way to answer that is through an idea called modeling. Modeling is an incredibly important concept in human development because, whether we realize it or not, a lot of our behaviors and tendencies and even expectations for ourselves are determined by what we see from others. This is especially true in children. Kids pick up an absolute ton from what's known as social learning, or internalizing things like behaviors and rules from what's going on around them, without really having it directly explained. This is super useful if you're a kid trying to figure out how school works, but I would argue that it's also really, really important to the growth of basketball around the world. And here's why. Let's say that it's the mid to late 1980s, and you're a super talented youngster growing up somewhere like Spain. You could have the ability to be an NBA Hall of Famer, but if there's no model for you to emulate, no path laid out for you to get to that point, it's going to be so much harder for you to get there. You may not even be able to envision it. You may have only seen a couple of games in your entire life, let alone seen someone with a similar background to yours playing in one. But then something wonderful happens. The Olympics come to your hometown and bring with them the Dream Team, the greatest collection of basketball talent the game has ever seen. And there they are, right there, Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and Patrick Ewing playing against the top players from your home country. Suddenly, the gap between you and getting to where those guys are doesn't seem quite so enormous. You have a model right in front of you of how you could get to play against these guys someday. And, just for the sake of argument, let's say that your name is Pau, and you're a 12-year-old living in Barcelona with your brother Mark, and by following that path, you both get to live out those dreams someday. And then, by becoming an NBA Hall of Famer, you become the model for someone else, who picks up where you left off and takes that path to places that you scarcely could have imagined when you started playing this sport. This is how, in just 3 generations of basketball players, we've gone from international guys being an oddity that no one really knew what to make of, to a huge part of the identity of the NBA that the league wouldn't be the same without. If you grow up believing and knowing something's possible because you've seen it, there's a much greater chance that it will become possible for you too. Using models from the past 30 years, both the international players looking to make the leap to the NBA and the league itself have learned from their experiences. They've learned how to maximize international talent while also minimizing the risks that have tripped people up in the past. There are so many more people that have contributed to this than I have time to mention, both players and otherwise, but they've all helped to create a path that's so well-traveled that the gap between the league and the rest of the world is small enough that guys don't have to worry about it nearly as much as they used to. And if they don't have to worry about that, they can focus on being the best basketball players on the planet. It all started with a dream, which then grew into a real idea, and then finally turned into a reality. Will there be a Phase 4? I don't know. I hope so, but in any case, the National Basketball Association is a fully international league now, and that's something that the entire world can appreciate. Hi everyone, My name is Will, and if you're here for the first time, this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we have discussions about sports psychology and culture that I'd like to think are meaningful, but I guess that's more for you to decide. If you did find this beneficial, please let us know by giving the video a like, or even by leaving a comment or signing up for the Patreon. This video was an absolute joy to put together because I absolutely love talking about old school NBA stuff, but it still took a lot of time and effort to make, and any support of any kind is greatly appreciated. I've got some really cool stuff coming up in the next couple of months, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it with y'all, but for this video, this is the end. Hope to see you back here next time, but until then, I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game. Bye!